Hi class, this week we're going to work on chapters 35 and 52. So please keep that in mind. 35 is about landlords and tenant law. A leasehold is an interest in real property that terminates on a certain date. The leasehold itself is personal property and has three major forms: the estate for years, the periodic tenancy, and the tenancy at will. The estate for years has a definite beginning and end, and it need not be measured in years. A periodic tenancy, sometimes known as estate from year to year or month to month, is renewed automatically until either the landlord or tenant notifies the other that it will end. A tenancy at will lasts only as long as both the landlord and tenant desire. Oral leases are subject to statute of frauds. In most cases, leases that last longer than a year must be in writing, and the lease must identify the parties and the premises, specify the duration, state the rent, and be signed by the party to be charged. The law imposes on the landlord certain duties toward the tenant and gives the tenant corresponding rights, including the right of possession, habitable conditions, and non-interference with use. The right of possession is breached if a third party has paramount title at the time the tenant is due to take possession. In most states, a landlord is obligated to provide the tenant with habitable premises, not only when the tenant moves in, but also during the period of time of the lease. The landlord must also refrain from interfering with the tenant's permissible use of the premises. If the landlord breaches an obligation, the tenant has several remedies. He may terminate the lease, recover damages, or in several states, use a rent-related remedy, which could be withholding rent or abatement. The tenant has duties also. The tenant must pay the rent. If she abandons the property and fails to pay, most states do not require the landlord to mitigate damages, but several states are moving away from that general rule. The tenant may physically change the property to use it in her best advantage, but she can't make structural alterations or commit waste. The tenant must restore the property to its original condition when the lease ends. This rule does not include normal wear and tear. Should the tenant breach any of her duties, the landlord may terminate the lease and seek damages. The interests of either landlord or tenant may be transferred freely unless the tenancy is at will. The lease requires either party to perform significant personal services that would be substantially less likely to be performed, or the parties agree that the interest may not be transferred. Despite the general rule that the tenant is responsible for injuries caused on the premises to outsiders, the landlord may have significant tort liability if there are dangers that he knows about, if there's defects that existed at the time the lease was signed and they injure the people off the premises, if the premises are rented for public purposes, if the landlord retains control of the premises, and if the landlord repairs the structure in a faulty manner. Chapter 52 is about international law. International law is not like domestic law of any one country. The sovereign or lawgiver in any particular nation state has the power to make and enforce laws within its territory, but globally there's no single source of law or law enforcement. Thus, international law is a collection of agreements between nation states with treaties or conventions, customary international law, primarily based on decisions of national court systems, and customary practices between nation states. There is an international court of justices, but it only hears cases between nation states. There is no international court for resolution of civil disputes, and no regional courts for that purpose either. The lack of unified law and prevalence of global commerce means that local and national court systems have had to devise ways of forcing judgments from one national court system or another to deal with claims against sovereigns and to factor in diplomatic considerations as national judicial systems encounter disputes that involve, either directly or indirectly, the political and diplomatic prerogatives of sovereigns. In terms of regulating trade, the traditional practice of imposing taxes or tariffs on imports from other countries has been substantially modified by the emergence of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade Rules, as now enforced by the World Trade Organization. The United States has a practice of regulating exports, however, to take into account national security and other foreign policy considerations. For example, the Export Administration Act of 1985 has controlled certain exports that would endanger national security, drain scarce materials from the U.S. economy, or harm foreign policy goals. The U.S. Secretary of Commerce has a list of controlled commodities that meet any of these criteria.